Hi everyone. Today I'm going to continue the discussion of Soviet tank tactics. My last video about tactics in Soviet tank brigades in 1942 got quite a bit of interest, but a lot of people asked if I was going to cover different eras and different equipment, since that video was very specifically tailored to tanks that were being produced in early 1942. The answer is yes, so in this video I'm actually going to cover some very early thinking around tank warfare in the Soviet Union. This is going to be based on field manuals from the era. Unfortunately, I don't have tactical level documents in such detail as you saw earlier, but there are still quite a few specific tactical scenarios described, and there's some graphics in these ones as well. So, without further ado, let's get started. Soviet tank technology in the early to mid-1930s was really taking off. There was a transition from the old clunky MS-1 tanks to improved license-built clones of the Vickers tank, so the T-26, and the Christie tank, so the first the BT-2 and then the BT-5, and you got the BT-7 by 1935. In 1935, there was a very large exercise known as the Big Kiev Maneuvers, since it was held in the Kiev military district. And based on these maneuvers, a lot of the theoretical kind of thinking was put into practice, and Soviet commanders really, probably for the first time, saw this kind of large mechanized force come into play. And of course, a lot of conclusions were drawn from this, and a few generations of tank manuals are written. So you hear a lot about kind of regressive Soviet military commanders that relied really on brute force and just kind of throwing manpower at the enemy to win. And this was, you know, to some degree, the infantry was still the king of the battlefield. Artillery, aircraft, and tanks were just they were just developed to support infantry. But as you could see, even this 1936 version of the manual holds tanks in very high esteem, and a lot of the discussion is specifically about both how to use tanks in support of infantry and how to use tanks independently of infantry. The manual states, "The infantry, in close cooperation with artillery and tanks, decides the course of battle with its decisive action on the attack and preservation of its position on the defense. Tanks have great mobility, powerful fire, and enormous striking power. While these qualities are valuable in battle, it is necessary to consider the technical limits of the materiel, the physical condition of the crews, requirements for food and repairs." So the Soviet system of armament described several different kinds of tanks, but the 1936 version of the field manual really only had two categories of tanks described in it. These were infantry support tanks. These were tanks that would accompany the infantry in battle and supported directly with their fire, and long-range tanks. These were tanks designed for penetrations, exploitation, and just kind of long-range independent actions. Infantry tanks are issued one battalion at a time. The battalion is subordinate to a rifle division commander. It's the commander's job to ensure that infantry and artillery that are also subordinate to the commander can cooperate with these tanks effectively. The commander can split up this battalion as he sees fit, up to units of one platoon. A platoon would typically be assigned to a battalion of infantry. Long-range tanks, since they work on higher-level objectives, these are assigned to a corps commander, or they could also be assigned to a division commander as well. The idea behind these long-range tanks is that you use them to form long-range striking groups. So these long-range striking groups can operate as far deep in enemy rear as 25 to 35 kilometers. They are used mainly in the offensive in a very interesting way, which I will discuss later. So on the offensive, tanks are used primarily to aid the infantry's advance. Their primary purpose is to destroy enemy machine gun nests and barbed wire emplacements and various other impediments in the infantry's way. However, the tanks aren't here just to support the infantry. The manual describes that the tanks give the army the ability to attack the enemy simultaneously in multiple points across a wide front, and that Tanks can be used to cut the enemy's forces into pieces, isolate the little pockets of resistance, and destroy them. In order to do this, the tanks would have to be followed by infantry in armored personnel carriers. Now, unfortunately, the Red Army never received an armored personnel carrier in the interbellum years, but you can tell that this kind of policy was written with future developments in mind. So the infantry support tanks work very closely with artillery. The main idea is that there's a World War I style creeping artillery barrage in order to destroy anti-tank guns. The infantry support tanks must follow the barrage as closely as possible. Since they are impervious to shrapnel, they would be able to mop up any survivors and allow the infantry to close in for a decisive close-range attack. According to the manual, the more tanks you have, the more you can sort of dilute your infantry forces and attack a wider front with the same number of people. So one battalion of infantry supported by one battalion of artillery and one company of tanks can attack on a 600 meter wide front. If you have more artillery and more tanks, you can stretch that up to 1,000 meters. An entire rifle division supported by a regiment of artillery and a battalion of tanks can attack on a front that is between 3 and 3.5 kilometers wide. If there are fewer tanks, the manual states that you can make up their shortage with more artillery, and all you have to do is execute longer barrages. The manual does suggest that in order to maximize the amount of useful daylight, artillery barrages should start just before dawn so that tanks and infantry can attack as soon as the sun goes up. So now we get to the long-range tank groups. The long-range tank groups are interesting because there's two different ways you can use them. They can be applied as is done traditionally during World War II, where they're introduced into a breach made by the infantry and the infantry support tanks, in which case they fight on a narrower front that's as narrow as 300 meters, but can be as wide as 1,000 meters depending on the terrain. And their purpose is really the same as you see a decade later. Once you break through the enemy defenses, these tanks enter the breach and just wreck enemy rear echelons. The idea was that, even if this is a multi-echelon defense system, the second and third line of defense won't be as good. The organization of the anti-tank defenses won't be as good, and so these long-range tanks can really do some damage in the rear area. However, the 1936 manual describes a different way in which you can use these tanks. What you can do with them is you can actually strike before the infantry and their supporting tanks arrive. In this case, you have to time the attack such that the confusion and distraction of these tanks attacking upsets the enemy forces, and they are that much weaker when the main brunt of the attack comes. In this case, the tanks attack on a much narrower 300 to 400 meter front. This attack is supported by a large amount of artillery, and it has to be the priority. So all artillery supports these penetrating blows, and until those are over, it doesn't support the remaining offensive. Of course, in these cases, it is much better to strike the enemy from the side or strike them in an unpredictable location. The manual does say that the commander needs to use their discretion in order to figure out what's the best way to use the tanks and what's the best way to strike. Using tanks without artillery support is completely forbidden because the manual does admit that the modern anti-tank guns by 1936 far outpaced the development of armor, and both the T-26 and the BT tanks, and even the heavier tanks like the T-35, were only really resistant to heavy machine gun fire. Tanks are also useful on the defensive. In this case, the name of the game is counterattacks. So tanks must be held in reserve, hidden in concealed positions, and once enemy infantry or cavalry or tanks break through, they have to be used to counterattack and pursue the enemy once they are retreating. The manual does state that, and I quote, "A modern line of defense is an anti-tank line of defense." So each branch of the armed forces has to defend against enemy tanks. This includes, sappers, of course, because they have anti-tank mines and various fortifications, but this also includes infantry as well. And both the 1935 and 1936 manuals talk a lot about how infantry can help when fighting against tank attacks, and kind of highlights the drawbacks that a tank has when fighting infantry. Of course, it does indicate that the best way of fighting enemy tanks is to let your artillery or your tanks do it, and the best thing infantry can do is to suppress enemy infantry and cut them off from the tanks. Once they are in the depth of your defenses with no infantry supporting them, the tanks become blind and they're easily dispatched by anti-tank guns. Now, there is another kind of battle that you could get into, and that is an encounter battle. In this case, the idea is that you have a tank unit in your vanguard, and the tank unit must deploy and surround and destroy the tanks of the enemy vanguard as quickly as possible, while they are supported by mobile artillery. Unfortunately, much like the APCs, the USSR never really developed satisfactory mobile artillery. In the interbellum years, there were some very promising tanks like the T-26-4 and the BT-7 artillery version, but unfortunately, these were not produced in significant numbers. So all of these descriptions were for units whose main striking force is infantry. The manual does describe a different kind of unit. This is a mechanized brigade. A mechanized brigade can fight separately from the main force. It can penetrate very deeply into enemy defenses. The idea here is everything is mobile, so the infantry is in APCs, the artillery is all self-propelled guns, and of course you have the tanks. And all of this is supported by aircraft, so these mechanized brigades can penetrate deeply into enemy territory and fight a long distance away from the main forces for a long period of time. So there you have it. These are the sort of main ideas around tank fighting that were described by Soviet military thinkers in the mid-1930s. Of course, a lot of these are still ideas. In order to execute them in practice, it takes a lot of, training and practice. Your commanders have to be comfortable with a certain degree of independent thought and independent action. Unfortunately, in the next couple of years, there are the purges, and the army begins to grow after that at an alarming rate. And as you probably know, in the early days of the Great Patriotic War, the Red Army falls victim to a lot of the issues that are described in this manual as something that you should not do, and it takes quite a while before they can execute the sort of classic breakthrough and breakthrough exploitation maneuvers that are described in this 1930s manual. So really, the thinking was there, the ideas were there. Unfortunately, the Red Army was not able to get enough practice until June 22nd, 1941 to really effectively apply these ideas until much, much later.